Gracias a la alianza entre Inexmoda y las universidades italianas Nava y Dommus Academy, se abren convocatorias en Colombia para otorgar media beca para estudiar maestría en artes, moda y diseño textil, maestría en diseño de moda o el máster en diseño de accesorios. Queremos darle la bienvenida a la directora del Departamento de Moda y Diseño de la Dommus Academy. Con ustedes, Bárbara Trebitsh. El tema de su conferencia, Fashion Metrics.
Good morning. I'm very pleased and honored to be here today. First of all, I would like to excuse because I wanted to try to make this presentation in Spanish, but actually my Spanish knowledge is so poor that I felt too insecure to do it. And I'm really grateful you made the effort to be here for an English-speaking conference. What the fashion matrix is about. We call fashion matrix a system that has globally changed in the latest few years. Meaning that fashion as a global phenomena has become a challenge. In these days, being here in this beautiful contest of Colombia Moda, I was asked many, many times, what did I think about Colombian fashion toward Italian fashion or European fashion or American fashion? And the answer that came naturally to me, if you think in depth about that, is that fashion nowadays and will be more and more global. There is an interesting quote to introduce my thought about that. That is from Anatole France, the famous writer, that explains the importance and the meaning of fashion worldwide, even though it was written many, many decades ago. If in the tones of works that will be published 100 years after my death, I was given the chance to choose one book, you know which one I would select? In this library of the future, I would not choose a novel, no, not an history book. Simply, my friend, I would take a fashion magazine to understand what women will wear 1 century after my death. And those clothes would give me more information about humanity in the future than all the philosophers, the writers, the preachers, and the scientists together. One of the reasons why I love this sentence is because working in an academic field together with academics involved in architecture and service design and, let's say, more cultural branded disciplines, I wanted to make a statement about the importance of fashion. We never reflect upon the fact that in the design disciplines, fashion is the most relevant to people, considering that there is the biggest proximity with our bodies and with our body language. And this is something not to be forgotten, and this is probably one of the most powerful parts of the success of fashion. That is not garment, it's a phenomena. The importance of fashion in the economic as well as social international system is nowadays globally recognized. The last 20 years have seen a constant and irreversible change of the fashion system. Cultural and market globalization have determined a different attitude and a preparation in all actors of the field. Consequently, the study, the approach to the project, took the designers to challenge all the previous methods adopted in order to define a collection. Fashion as individual sensitivity. Fashion states simultaneously and clearly the myth of the mutation, Jean Baudrillard wrote. Simultaneity, synchronicity, the contraction of space and time, as well as the influence of contamination of parallel universes to fashion, determine today the development of ideas. Carl Jung said, "It's enough to know that no ideas or essential concessions lack historical roots. Finally, they are all founded on primordial archetypical forms whose expressive nature goes back to an era where conscience was not thinking, yet it perceived. When we talk about fashion design or design generally speaking, we cannot forget about this incredible tool that makes a designer talented or not. The perception, the development of individual sensitivity becomes driver of the creative process. And now, the more questionable part. I was listening to the previous presentation that was incredibly good and professional, and I really appreciate. So please don't misunderstand me when I say that fashion is no more trends. It's a provocative but real approach that is not directed to general public or general contractors of the field, but to designers. What do we mean? Trends, as intended in the past, do not exist anymore, as well as the marketing approach used to define age and social class targets. These two parameters that supported professionals creating a homologation of styles have been transformed. Just to make an example, I'm pretty aged in this field, and when in the beginning of the 80s, I was facing for my very first time fashion design as a discipline. We were taught, generally speaking, in the advanced made in Italy cultural field, okay, the brief was try to design a garment for a businesswoman, age 25, 35, do it. You went to a fair, you found very basic trends, directions like, okay, this year it's Charleston, Africa, and white. And you put together everything in a mixer, getting out with a collection. At that time it worked. It worked because it was a newborn field, fashion. But how many things have changed in the latest years? Which is the challenge that a designer should do. A designer cannot be a trend follower. A designer has to be a trend setter. And this is the real difference because, as I was telling you before, considering that fashion is no more a local area, but a global area in which we are interconnected continuously, we cannot overcome this challenge. The image you're seeing, it can sound as a paradox, are macro trends I did as a consultant 5 years ago. If you look at them, you can find something here and there that could be valuable today as well. And this is the demonstration that within a system in which trends are not absolute any longer, or better, are simply not, we can still find a sort of continuity in the style of the designers season after season. If you look at style.com, style.it, all the websites that are showing in almost in real time the collection of designers, obviously looking at these collections after they've been done, you can select some fil rouge between them in order to build some area of trends that can be communicated to the final customer, because this is what it's all about. But if you look more attentively to the designer's collection, not just the latest season, but let's say the last 5 or 6 seasons, you can make an analysis that is much more in-depth, and it is regarding the identity of the successful ones. This is why the designer must put himself at the core of the production system in order to be able to provide interpretation of style with a contemporary and consequently sellable value. This is a questionable issue. In Italy, we have had since 5 years a lot of discussion about the dualism in companies between designers and marketing managers or commercial side of the company. And I'm sure this is an issue in every country we go. Obviously, everybody has to have his role, but sometimes the problem is that the market, the world, the social aspect of the society in which we live in have evolved much faster than the business system of the field. This to mean that a designer nowadays is not just and cannot be just someone able to make nice garments. It's not enough anymore. I live in a city, Milan, where we have an incredible amount of schools of fashion, and where still the system is present, that are generating a lot of designers every year. And they're all good nowadays because youngsters are talented, are informed, have an access to information that my generation didn't have. The competition is not anymore in your country or in another place, but is global. That makes it much more difficult. This is to mean that there are three main characteristics that a fashion designer should have: identity, inspiration, and innovation. These are the recognizable values of the brand and are the most important driver for success. The designer has to create its own world of references. He needs a cultural background to support his approach to design and needs to understand the market, but without being influenced by it. This is the most delicate balance. It's about the process. I was mentioning you before the way we were taught in the 80s how to face the design project. Nowadays, it's much different. And when you create something, you cannot just go straight to the product, because this will put down the level of your creativity and the level of your vision in order to be able to propose your own statement as a designer or as a brand, because at the end of the day, it's the same thing. What is relevant is to be able to look attentively and to study all the phenomena, including the market phenomena, but without being a follower also on that side. What happens in companies is that obviously marketing manager and the commercial side are often pushed forward for numbers, and their role is not to think wide in this sense, but to make sure that every season, every collection, every pre-collection, every cruise collection, because nowadays we cannot talk anymore about 2 seasons per year, but about 8 seasons per year per gender, they have to make sure that they will be sellable and that they will be successful. In the latest 5 years, as I was mentioning you before, there is a big attention in the formation of managers as well as designers to create a common language in which they can really make a match and build a success, listening to each other with a different attitude. So, which is the role of the designer? To create ideas in this field implies the creation of a concrete methodological approach that the designer can elaborate independently. The role of designers need more and more to be related to different areas of interest in order to be an art director, able to manage many aspects of the brand, from design to distribution to communication. The designer of the future must be able to suggest a new world. It has to be a storyteller, not simply a technician, not simply a good artist, not simply someone that has a vision without a clue. The designer of the future must be able to suggest new world, and this is the sense we need to give to our work, to integrate processes in multidisciplinary fields and in a facet of opinions and visions. Which is the method, though? I simplified, because to talk about one method good for all would be too easy. It's like, let me just make you an example talking about cooking, that now is the new fashion If you look at the world now, all the interest, globally speaking, is about cooking and cuisine, more than to fashion. It's the new phenomena. This is a macro trend that is really interesting to take into consideration for designers as well that should be curious about all the world. If you think about cooking, everything sounds pretty easy. You buy your book of recipe, you read it, you do it. So why there are chefs that are so famous and so great, and when I try to do the same recipe, it comes out horrible? Probably it's not enough to have the right instruction. Probably it's about also intangible values. It's about talent, it's about taste, it's about sensitivity, and also it's about the fact that when we talk about creative disciplines, rules are there to be changed very quickly. And it's not enough to apply a rule, but the most difficult process that a designer, especially a young designer, should do nowadays is to know very well the rules in order to transform them according to its own needs and its own personality. Which is the other aspect that is very relevant, the analysis of the brand identity, roots, message, and meaning. We usually work with a lot of companies, and if 10 years ago companies were facing the academic field trying to look for just simply new ideas, oh, look, that trousers are so nice, this kind of aspect. Nowadays it's changed totally. Companies are much more evolved than that. Companies have already their own designers that are very professional and able to manage the product development. What is relevant for a young designer, whatever he works for someone else or for his own brand, is to understand which is the story he wants to tell. Just like a director of a movie. He has to put all the elements together in order to tell a story that is successful, and that has to please both the critics and the public. Obviously, if in a creative field a designer starts his own collection with all these worries, this could affect the process. But this doesn't mean not to understand and evaluate this aspect. If I design for Seven for Mankind, or if I design for another kind of denim brand, or Diesel, that have different stories, different approaches, different meaning also to the final customer, I will have to take this into deep consideration. And for a professional, to find a balance, especially when one is very talented, between its own creativity, its own identity, and the identity of another brand, it's one of the most difficult issues that needs a real professional attitude. Which is the other part, the definition of inspirational trends based on personal perception of the brand or of the designer. Once again, it's about storytelling. What inspirational trends are? Not the trends of the next season, not the trends of another year. These are the trends that are part of our own identity. It's our identity card that obviously will transform during the years as we transform ourselves as human beings, but not with the rapidity that apparently is requested by the market. We recently have done a project with Antonio Berardi, and Antonio Berardi is renowned as a sort of an avant-garde designer. And there were two things that are very interesting that he said to the students. First, don't come to me because I am an avant-garde designer with a jacket with 6 sleeves. I'm not interested. I think it's a stupid thing, and it's too easy to be creative doing something that isn't wearable. The second thing was, I don't want to see a mood board with the trend of the next season. I want to see your thoughts in the next 10 years. And I think this is a valuable lecture that, for me too, honestly speaking, that was really relevant for the students. I think that the next generation of designers are the one that will make the difference in this field and that will design the evolution that this field is now living. Just to make an example, yesterday I was talking with a journalist, and we were talking about the fact that there is a global crisis nowadays, particularly in our country and in Europe. And obviously, most of the Italian brands, but not only Italian brands, as well as French or some British brands, are owned by big groups. Arnaud, Pinot, Prada, Gucci, Diesel. And this makes the panorama of the fashion field much different. And the question was, what a young designer, how can a young designer establish himself? How can be successful? And in my opinion, I think that technology and also customer attitudes have changed so rapidly, and they're rapidly, increasingly changing, that this crisis could be, it sounds as a paradox, I understand that, an opportunity for the youngsters. In Italy, stores, also historical stores, are going through a crisis that is not simply due to a money income that is lower, but to the online shopping. The web has become the new driver that support young designers to become known and to make a viral marketing in a moment all around the world, jumping all the typical steps that my generation was used to go through. If you wanted to establish your own line 20 years ago, you had to go to a showroom for the PR, then to a showroom for the distribution, then to make relationship with the press, then to try to be on the catwalk of a fashion week. I'm not saying this doesn't exist anymore, because it's still important. But I've seen cases of viral success, of very tiny and small production of students, or former students, or young professionals that have established almost by joke small collections, often monodirectional, like all trousers or all bags or all jewelry, and having an incredible success. About that, yesterday, I was in the same chat I had with the journalist here. We were discussing this aspect, and I think that this is not the time for new, big, huge, powerful, and rich, established designers to be formed. But this panorama is leading the fashion field to generate an incredible amount of new offer that will not talk to all the world in terms of customer, will talk to all the world in geographical terms, but will be niche. And this is really important, because if you look at the customer habits, I can talk about Europe, obviously, nobody is looking anymore for the established brands only, because when you travel, you go all around the world, from Hong Kong to Medellin, to Rome, to Paris, or whatever, you find always the same goods, always the same stuff. The success of vintage, the trends of vintage that is going on since 10 years now, was arising exactly from this phenomena. In the pyramid of style, the most stylish people didn't want to be all alike all around the world, because it was just a matter of income. The idea nowadays for the final user of fashion is to build and to use fashion to build its own identity, not to be labeled from head to toe like it was at the very beginning. And to use vintage meant to make a cultural statement in your look, to mix up with other things. And also the success of what we call democratic brands like Zara, H&M, that were considered only the copiers is increasingly growing, and it's not rare to find, it happened to me a few weeks ago in the store of a Creator of Science, which is the upper grade line of H&M. I found on a Saturday morning, at least in 1 hour, more than 10 people, very important people from the Milanese fashion field, buying. This is not because of a money issue, it's because of fun. It's because the real trend now is to mix and match. Perhaps your Louboutin shoes, your Prada bag, your dress from H&M, your, I don't know, scarf from Pucci, and have fun. And I think that this has to be taken into consideration, because when we design collections, these are potential competitors, especially for new brands. Nowadays, fashion is called, the new trend is called contemporary fashion, meaning a fashion that is wearable, comfortable, stylish, elegant. That is the inspirational trend for this kind of area. Let's go back to the list of the things. The definition of the inspiration with multi-references and one in-depth research. The definition of materials, the creation of materials, especially when talking about new brands, niche brands that are not able, particularly at the very beginning, to answer to the constraints of the market in terms of fabrications, prints, or colors. Because I don't know how it works in this country, but in Italy, especially nowadays, it's a nightmare. If you want to buy a fabric to make your own collection, you have to buy minimum 300 meters, one color and one quality. Try to imagine a new brand or a young designer trying to establish his own brand with these constraints. Yes, sure, you can buy also just 50 meters. But the problem is that it will cost more than the double. And the other problem is that you cannot exit with so high prices in your first exit of the collections, because the stores will make a 300% upload of your prices, and you will not be sellable, and you will close. So one thing that is really important, I'm not mean that students or designers should go back to the hands-on work in a general approach. But it is important to be able to think and invent your textiles as well in order to create something different with those constraints. And this is valid as well with big brands. The definition of the volumes, shapes and details. Sometimes we tend to be a little bit bidimensional in that side. And I think that the great lecture that big maestros like Azzedine Alaïa and other designers have done and have left to us is about the construction of the garment. To be able to know exactly the technical aspect in order to be able to transform, innovate, and create. Let's go to the more boring part for a designer. The definition of collection construction defined by needed items. If I go back to not so much time ago, but let's say 10 years ago, collections were huge. I'm not talking only about new brands, but established brands. You were seeing fashion show that never ending, and it was even boring, and they had to make at least a certain number of outfits in one way, a certain number of outfits in another way. And you had at least 200, 300 items, not looks, but items per collection. Nowadays, even the big brands are shrinking the number for each collection. I'm not talking about the pre-collection that are shrinked already because they are selling moments. And they have to concentrate everything upon a few number of items. Once, when you were doing, for instance, a winter collection, you had to make at least 5 to 10 coats Who is wearing coats nowadays? How many coats did you see looking at style.com at the shows for the winter collection? Probably you will see cape, you will see duvet, you will see many other things. The rules are totally destroyed. Obviously, you have to dress up someone, but you can also decide that you're going to do only certain things and not others, according, and I go back to what I was saying before, to your identity. And then, and I come back to what I was telling you about the fabrications, the price. Nowadays, we cannot play with prices. It has to be coherent with the brand image and the perception that the customer can have. This is really relevant when making a project, when jumping from the project to the production issues. And this is something that even if in every company there are product manager, and that's, let me say, it's the most nightmare work ever in this field. I have a lot of admiration for project manager because they have the worst role in the business. Still, the designer should be aware of these aspects, not to create too low products coming from a very high idea. Then, not meaning that the designer should be a photographer or a still life photographer or a graphic designer. There is the issue of building the final image, the styling. Nowadays, stylists are very popular in our field. In Italy, they are the new designers, meaning that they are consultants for designers because usually the art director of the designer of a company is too personally involved in its creation to be able to look at them from a side. But still, the designer is involved in the construction of the advertising campaign, of the styling, of the general image. Because it's like writing a message on a paper and then expecting that someone else will send it through email. You have to manage all these aspects in order to be able to give the right message, coming back to the fact that the designer is and has to be a storyteller. The press and image. This is a collection, for instance, that is done by a former student. She's very successful now. She was selected at Uso Next in Rome last July. And not just because she's young and she's new designer, but because she takes care of all aspects, from the graphic side to the image, the selection of the models and so on. She has a complete control upon the communication that her garments are going through. Distribution. I was telling you before about with the web, new approach of different fashion showrooms, and the selection of the right place, the selection of the right stores where you would like to be. If you start a collection or if you are a brand and you think about your positioning, the awareness is one of the most relevant things. There is a project I have a lot of fun to do with my students at the beginning of the year that is a sort of a small challenge. Try to establish your own brand with all these constraints, make a small collection, like a capsule collection, and then tell me in which store you see your collection, in which store you think your collection could fit. And you discover an incredible unawareness sometimes and naivete, because if I use textiles that are not appropriate and then I pretend to be in the top multi-brand store of New York, probably I need to know much better these aspects. I know that to advanced professionals this can sound obvious, but I can tell you, for young designers, it's not. We all were so much in love as creative creatures with what we do that sometimes we tend not to see them objectively. That doesn't mean it's good or bad, they're nice or they're not. It means simply to know exactly to whom you are talking, to whom you're telling your story. And then the store image. Obviously, this is something that a small brand or a brand that is going in a multi-store brand store cannot control. But when I talk about shop's image, I'm talking about also online. I'm talking also about the monobrand stores that are going through so many difficulties nowadays that they really have to create an experience, not just a place where to go and get a dress or a t-shirt or a pair of shoes. This is just to list all the rules, let's say, even though I don't like this word because I think it's totally opposite to the philosophy that a designer should have. And then we go to fashion vision. We were mentioning before the quote from Carl Jung about the perception that is not rational, but it's something totally personal. Fashion vision is the most important aspect to be supported in order to be able to manage and be connected with the issues that need to be explored for a successful brand. It is not such an intangible aspect, but on the contrary, a constant training to be driven by brands and designers, obviously, in order to be competitive and innovative. Never relax on your talent. Never sit down. The big brands, the big designers, the good ones, even going through difficult moments in their careers, the characteristic they have maintained toward their approach to fashion is curiosity and its sensitivity. It's easy to sit down on a success and then disappear in a couple of seasons. Look at others' work and word of references without being inspired. And especially for young designers and for passionate of this field, this is one of the most difficult things. We all love certain designers. I'm sure that if I will ask to this audience, who is your favorite designers? Each of you will have at least 2 or 3 brands or designers you love. And this is normal, and this is good, this is okay. But when it comes to you as a designer, you can admire someone else's work. You can go in depth into the understanding of the meaning of the work of a designer or a brand that you love. But be very careful not to be a follower. And this is something that often can happen. And more important, look at the itself characteristics in order to enhance them. The understanding of our identity. Sometimes we have students that are designing even beautiful things, and when you ask them, would you wear it? No. And not for physical reasons. I mean, I'm not a tiny teenager, but I could hypothetically wear it a mini skirt. I wouldn't buy as a final customer, but it's something that if I was much taller and much slimmer and much younger and much many other things, probably I would buy. It's not about physical pertinence, it's about mental pertinence. And sometimes these are sounding like obvious things, but it's really rare that a young designer, or even not so young, such a young designer, are taking into consideration these aspects. And at the end, look at the constant social and global changes in order to match the future. Just to mention an example, in the latest years, there has been an incredible amount of work about fashion and sustainability. And this is a very delicate issue that has been often, unfortunately, used by many brands as a marketing tool, as a communication tool, without getting into the clue. Which sense has to buy a t-shirt done with corn yarn, and we know that corn is produced in the US and it's OGM and it has to be transported by plane to Europe? How much does it make sense in ecological terms? Everybody is asking young designers to be aware of this aspect when doing projects. But only since a couple of years, there are institutions that are giving a full, wide information approach to them, because a designer is not a technician. But there is another phenomena. There are other sides of sustainability that can be approached, even if they are not taking into consideration all aspects. We have one example in Vicenza, near in Veneto, that is pretty relevant. It is a brand that has been established by a crazy textile manager that has a company in Vicenza that is called Bonotto, Lanificio Bonotto, which is pretty famous. And he established in his area a line that is called Kilometro Zero, 0 kilometers. It does not pretend to use exotic fibers to make something sustainable or to communicate no matter what. But it's very simply the approach. So he said, I cannot help it until a certain point. What I can do is to limit the use of fuel in the transportation. In an area of 4 kilometers, I have all that I need: the yarn, the textile, the lab, the production, and the logistic, which means saving a lot of energy. So when we talk about constant social changes, we should be aware on one side of the process as designer and on the other end of the consumer. Even though the approach to fashion that I was mentioning before about democratic fashion is still very strong, there is now another trend toward it. That means that many young customers or fashion addicts are not anymore so fascinated by these brands because they say, you know, on one end, I would like to buy a t-shirt in Zara because at the end of the day, the quality is not proportionally so far from a t-shirt I can buy from a big brand, but the price is incredibly lower and they can consume it. And who cares if it doesn't last? But on the other hand, I care if it doesn't last because we are going on producing and producing and producing, but at the end of the day, we're talking about sustainability using exotic fibers. So there is a continuous contradiction, and I think that, and my message today is also for designers to look at these aspects in depth, not be superficial, not be marketing oriented, not be tricked into this aspect, but go seriously into them, because this is really what will be very relevant in the next future. Now, I would like to conclude showing you a couple of projects that have been developed in the Academy. They're very different one from each other. And I think that the different path that they have followed to determine the projects can explain very well and better than any other word what I was trying to communicate with my speech. I can't hear the music. I'm sorry.
to be a glowing light, just want to be empty. Love for sure, I'll cry. Don't want to be a glowing light, just want to be empty. Dark sky, rinse me with rain and I'll cry for sure. I'll cry. Don't want to be a glowing light, just want to be empty. Dark sky, rinse me with rain and I'll cry for sure. I'll cry. Don't want to be a glowing light, just want to be empty. Dark sky, rinse me with rain and I'll cry for sure. I'll cry. Don't want to be a glowing light, just want to be empty. Dark sky, rinse me with rain and I'll cry for sure. Okay, and I will show you, thank you. This was done in collaboration with Seven for Mankind brand, but in a way, but in a very particular way, meaning that they wanted to see a future vision, not the collection for the next season, working with denim. This is another project what we're going to see now that is done by a different student in a different project, just to show different approaches using the same methodologies.
So this concludes my presentation. Thank you a lot to all of you for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Barbara Trebitsh. A todos los asistentes, muchísimas gracias. Nuestra próxima conferencia dentro de unos minutos para lucir bien por dentro y por fuera. Los esperamos a todos.